A flicker of hallway light cuts across his smile as he locks the door behind him. The moment freezes around us as if the air thickens with the same electric tension pulsing through the flickering bulb above my head, a dim, uneven pulse that makes every shadow on the wall twitch with uneasy life. I stand still, my hand hovering near the counter edge, trying to read something in the stiffness of his shoulders, something in the way his eyes avoid mine, even though he came here tonight with a purpose he hasn't named. The light falters again, breaking the room into sharp fragments that catch the corners of his expression. And for a second I see a hardness there that feels colder than the night wind seeping through the window frame. I keep my breath shallow, watching his hands as he sets his keys down with too much precision, as if the metal touching the table might betray a tremor he doesn't want me to see. The flickering bulb buzzes once more, an insect-like hum that wraps itself around the silence stretching between us, a silence filled with questions I shouldn't have to ask and answers he's already decided not to give. I have lived with this man long enough to sense when he's hiding something, long enough to understand that stillness can be its own form of threat. He steps farther into the room, pacing slowly, almost measuring the floor with each step, and the faint glow from the bulb leaves a thin trail of light sliding across his back like a moving blade. The tension gathers inside my chest, tightening with each second he refuses to break the silence. Each second he lets that almost smile sit on his face like a mask slipping at its edges. I swallow hard, keeping my voice steady as I ask why he came home so late, but he brushes the question aside with a half shrug, offering nothing but the faint echo of his shoes on the hardwood floor. The light stutters again, making two overlapping shadows break apart near his feet, a preview of the fractures neither of us has spoken aloud. I resist the urge to step back, even though something in his movement suggests I should. He looks around the room as if searching for the right place to set down a truth he isn't ready to release, and the flickering bulb catches the tension in his jaw. I tighten my grip on the counter's edge, grounding myself against the dread curling under my ribs as the silence stretches wide enough to swallow any illusion of normalcy. I wait for him to speak, but he holds the unspoken words inside like coals burning through the fabric of his composure. A thin breath escapes me as I study the shifting pattern of shadows on the wall. The air thickens further, weighted with a kind of pressure that makes my skin prickle, a pressure that warns me that whatever he's about to say will carve into the shape of my world with a cold, deliberate edge. I take one step closer, refusing to let the uncertainty push me backward, refusing to let his silence dictate the shape of this night. His quietness feels sharper than any accusation he could throw at me. The bulb flickers in quick succession, bright, dark, bright, and each pulse pulls the truth a little closer to the surface of his expression. He turns slightly, and the half-light frames his face with a tension that claws at the base of my spine. I ask again where he's been softer this time, but he replies only with a low exhale, as if my question is an inconvenience rather than a concern. I watch his shoulders rise and fall in a rhythm that doesn't match the calm he's pretending to hold. The room sways with light and shadow, a shifting landscape of fractured shapes that make it hard to focus on anything except the dread coiling inside my stomach. He finally steps toward me, slow, measured, his hands loose at his sides, yet somehow ready, and the smell of a cold air clinging to his coat mixes with the faint metallic scent drifting from the ceiling fixture. I feel the truth pressing against this moment, a truth waiting for him to release it like a blow. I brace myself, breathing shallowly, as he lets his gaze land on mine with a weight that feels punishing. My pulse hammers beneath my skin loud enough that it nearly drowns the low hum of the flickering bulb. I know something is coming. Something heavy, something jagged, something he's been carrying beneath that too controlled smile. I steady my stance, refusing to flinch when he finally opens his mouth, only to let another silence fall out instead of words. The pause stretches long enough to break something small inside me, and the bulb overhead flickers again, casting us into a momentary darkness that feels more honest than the dim, trembling light returning after it. I press my nails into my palm to keep my breath steady. He inhales sharply, the kind of breath someone takes before forcing out a truth they've polished into a weapon. My throat tightens. I wait. The light flickers once more, a final stutter before stillness. The truth hangs between us like a blade waiting to drop. The silence that follows stretches thin enough to tear, and the last tremor of the bulb freezes everything in a suspended flicker of fractured light. The shadows tighten, narrowing like a corridor leading directly into the moment I can feel rising ahead of me, heavy, final, and sharp. The night holds its breath, and I feel the threat of his unspoken words pressing against my spine like a cold hand. The room stays frozen under the frail glow, and the air tastes like the edge of something breaking. The truth waits behind his eyes, ready to strike as the light falters into stillness. I'm Erin Vale, 31, a medical billing analyst from Denver, Colorado, and that morning sits in my memory with a deceptive softness, the kind of quiet that only feels normal until you look back and realize how many pieces were tilting out of place before they finally snapped. The sunlight came in at a slant through the kitchen window, catching the thin glass reflection on the counter and bending it into a trembling band of pale light that kept shifting whenever I moved. I remember standing there with my hands wrapped around a warm mug, listening to the soft ticking of the kitchen clock, while Jason moved around the room with a calm so practiced it felt almost staged. He didn't look directly at me, choosing instead to study the refrigerator list as though he had never seen it before, his eyes darting briefly to the children's names and then away as if something there pricked him. I asked if he'd slept well, and his answer came a beat too late, a slow yeah, that didn't fit the rhythm of someone easing into a normal day. He adjusted his shirt collar twice, even though it wasn't crooked, and every small movement felt rehearsed, like he was performing normalcy rather than living it. The light from the window shifted again, sliding the glass reflection across the table toward his hands, and for a brief moment 2 thin shadows overlapped along the floor in front of him, the motif seed I didn't recognize for what it was, an early sign of something about to break. I should have asked why he kept checking the clock, or why he had glanced at his phone at least 3 times during breakfast, even though it hadn't vibrated once. But I told myself he was stressed, tired, maybe overwhelmed from work, all the excuses I had trained myself to pull from the shelf whenever something felt slightly off. He asked about the kids' schedule, and I told him the basics. But his face tightened as though he expected a different answer, as if he had rehearsed a reaction to something that I hadn't said. When the spoon clinked against his coffee mug, he flinched just enough for me to notice, and I pretended I didn't. The overhead vent clicked on blowing a cold draft that made the reflection stretch long and thin across the floor, almost touching his foot. He stepped away from it without seeming to notice. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't want the light touching him. He cleared his throat, asked what time I was planning to leave for work, though he already knew, and his voice carried a faint rasp that didn't match the smooth mask on his face. He held his phone with 2 hands, thumbs pressed along the edges, gripping it as though it were a secret he was afraid to drop. A notification flashed for a fraction of a second, just a glow too fast to read, and he swiped it away instantly, leaving behind a ghost of motion that made my pulse hitch just slightly. I watched him breathe through his nose, slow and steady, the kind of breath people take when they're trying to control something that keeps slipping. The kids came into the room laughing, and for a moment their noise filled the kitchen with the kind of warmth that usually softens him. But Jason only smiled halfway, the kind of smile meant to look natural from a distance, but completely empty up close. He ruffled their hair, but his eyes didn't follow their faces. They stayed fixed on his phone or on the ground as if the very shape of his children's joy was too heavy for him to hold that morning. I pretended not to notice that he didn't hug them back. He asked if I needed anything from the store later, but the question floated oddly in the air, disconnected from the rest of our conversation like a sentence pulled from a different script entirely. I asked if everything was okay at work, and he hesitated before giving a short nod, a mechanical motion with no emotion behind it. Something in his silence felt like a truth he wasn't ready to let escape. I watched him grab his jacket even though he wasn't leaving for another hour, watched him place it on the chair closest to the door, where the light turned the glass reflection into a trembling shape beside his shadow. He tapped his fingers on the table, a rhythm that didn't match the ticking of the clock. Something restless and uneven. When I asked again if something was wrong, he lifted his eyes, hesitated, then gave a thin smile that cracked at the edges like fragile porcelain pushed too far. The moment lasted only a second, but it was enough to lodge a cold thread of unease beneath my ribs. He stepped away from the window light, positioning himself where the reflection couldn't reach, and something about that small movement unsettled me more than any words could have. The kids tugged at his sleeve, asking if he'd watch their new drawing after work, and he promised he would, but the promise landed flat hollow, as if it had been spoken through a wall. His voice carried a distance in it, a faint tremor hiding beneath the calm. I watched him glance toward the hallway mirror, check his appearance with an urgency that didn't belong to an ordinary morning, and then look at me as if trying to confirm something silently. The reflection stretched again across the tile, and for a moment the two shadows slowed, widened, then merged before splitting apart once more. I didn't know why that image struck me, but it did. As he grabbed his keys, he paused, staring at the metal briefly before slipping them into his pocket with a sharp, deliberate motion. He moved toward the door without saying goodbye, stopping only when I called his name, my voice catching on a question I hadn't formed yet. He turned halfway, face unreadable, and simply said he'd be late tonight. No explanation. No softness. No certainty. The glass reflection broke into 3 thin lines on the floor as the door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed pressed into my ears like a warning I wasn't ready to understand. The morning felt calm, but something underneath it was already breaking. The glass reflection trembled one last time before fading into the kitchen's quiet, leaving me alone with a hollow feeling that didn't have a name yet. The day stretched ahead bright and ordinary, but the certainty of it had already cracked. The quiet wrapped around the room like a thin shell waiting to shatter. The last thing I remember from that moment is the strange chill settling along my spine as the door latched, carrying away the warmth that should have stayed. The air felt wrong, and the light felt thinner, as if the truth had already begun to slip into motion beneath the surface. The shadow from the window narrowed just slightly, hinting at a fracture waiting to deepen. The morning held stillness but not safety. The day was beginning to tilt. That afternoon lingers in my mind with an uneasy clarity, the kind that sharpens every sound, every gesture, every breath I took, as if the moment already knew it would become a turning point in the story I hadn't yet realized I was living through. I remember stepping outside to check the mailbox, the sun hanging low enough to cast long, uneven shadows across the pavement. each shadow bending at strange angles from the row of houses behind me. The air held a thin chill, not enough to bite, but enough to prickle the skin along my arms as I walked down the short path. I was halfway to the mailbox when Alex appeared from around the corner. Hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, posture stiff in a way I'd never seen before. He usually carried the relaxed confidence of a paramedic off duty, someone used to facing emergencies without letting them touch him. But that day, something in his stance made him look smaller, quieter, hesitant. He offered me a quick smile, thin and uneven, and asked how I was doing, though his voice wavered as if he already knew the answer and didn't know how to react to it. When he reached into his pocket, his hand trembled a small, noticeable shake that didn't fit the man who'd once lifted my daughter out of a tree when she'd gotten stuck. He pulled out a key silver and familiar and held it out toward me. The trembling key caught the afternoon light, making the tiny metal ridges shimmer in a way that only heightened the unease crawling beneath my skin. He said he found it near my front steps earlier, that it must have slipped from Jason's pocket. The name hit the air like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of discomfort through both of us. I took the key from him, feeling its cold surface press against my palm, feeling the tremor in his hand echo faintly into my own. I thanked him, but his eyes shifted downward, not meeting mine, as if he had more to say, but not enough courage to push the words out. Before I could ask what was wrong, he reached into his jacket again, pulling out an envelope folded in half with a faint crease running through its center. His fingers tightened around it for a moment, knuckles pale, before he extended it toward me. He said he hadn't meant to open it. Someone had accidentally slid it into his mailbox instead of mine, and he only realized after seeing my name on it. His explanation was too quick, too practiced, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't lying. I took the envelope, my fingers brushing the rough paper, and felt my chest tighten with a mixture of curiosity and fear that I couldn't quite swallow. Inside was a printed invoice, crisp and clean, with a set of fields neatly typed across the top, Ref H29, date 0413. Time 1436. Location Westbrook Clinic. The words hit me with a jolt, cold and disorienting. Westbrook Clinic was across town, a place I hadn't visited in months, and certainly not at that time or date. I stared at the document, scanning the service code, Cons 221, some kind of consultation appointment, and the total billed amount. My stomach dropped. I knew every medical charge associated with my family. Bills were my profession, my daily terrain, and this one was wrong. Completely wrong. My first instinct was to assume it was a mistake, a simple clerical error. But then I remembered Jason's stiff silence that morning, his restless fidgeting, the way he kept checking his phone as though waiting for something that never came. And suddenly, this wasn't just a wrong bill, it was a breadcrumb. I looked up at Alex, searching his face for answers he didn't seem sure he should give. He shifted on his feet, shoulders tightening as if wrestling with a choice. Then he said quietly that he'd seen Jason leave the clinic parking lot around the same time the invoice was generated. The words hit my chest like a blow. Jason had told me he'd been at the office the entire afternoon. He hadn't mentioned a clinic or an appointment or anything remotely close to what this invoice described. The trembling key in my hand suddenly felt heavier, as though the truth embedded in it was slowly sinking into my bones. I asked Alex if he was sure, and he nodded without hesitation, the memory visibly etched across his expression. He said he didn't mean to interfere, but he hadn't known whether to pretend he hadn't seen it or tell me outright. I thanked him again, though the word came out hollow, drained of its usual warmth. My heartbeat pulsed against my ribs with an irregular rhythm each beat, sending fresh waves of unease racing through me. I knew Jason wasn't impulsive. Every choice he made, every lie he had ever told had always been calculated, polished, woven neatly through layers of logic. And yet, here was the first thread pulling loose. A thread I hadn't known existed. I turned the invoice over in my hands, desperately searching for an explanation that didn't taste like betrayal. Ref, age 29. Time, 14:36. Location, Westbrook Clinic. None of it aligned with his story from that day. I replayed the morning in my mind, the distracted smile, the forced calm, the rushed movements. Pieces that felt random earlier now clicked into patterns, forming the first fracture line in a wall I had trusted for far too long. I asked Alex if he overheard anything else, but he only shook his head, apologizing again as if the truth he'd handed me was something fragile he wasn't sure I could hold. I assured him I was fine even though I wasn't. The lie felt heavy, thick on my tongue. He offered to stay, asked if I needed help with anything, but I forced a smile and told him I just needed time to think. When he finally walked away, I stared at the invoice, letting the numbers carve themselves deeper into my memory. A cold breeze swept across the street, brushing against the loose edges of the paper as I stood there clutching the trembling key and a truth I wasn't ready to admit out loud. When I finally turned to go back inside, the shadows on the pavement split and overlapped again, two shapes merging and unmerging as though the world itself was unsure of what it wanted to reveal. The invoice crumpled slightly under the pressure of my grip. I walked back toward the house with a weight pressing against my spine, a weight built of suspicion and disbelief, something sharp enough to cut, but not yet deep enough to bleed. Not yet. But the fracture had started. The truth had begun to move, and I could feel the next break coming. The courtyard felt too bright that afternoon, the kind of brightness that doesn't warm anything, but instead sharpens every edge of every object until the world looks like it's made of glass waiting to crack. Neighbors milled around the picnic tables, kids shouting near the swings, someone's music playing faintly from an open window. I had come down only to return a borrowed dish to the community rack. Nothing more, nothing dramatic, nothing that should have drawn eyes. But the moment I stepped into the courtyard, I noticed the metallic shadow stretching across the pavement, thin, sharp cast by the tall iron post lamp near the center. It sliced the ground in a clean line, as if marking a boundary no one else could see. I didn't know then that I would spend the next few minutes standing on one side of that line while my marriage shattered on the other. Jason appeared from the walkway near the parking lot. His stride clipped, his eyes locked on me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten instantly. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. And he certainly wasn't supposed to be here, but there he was, moving with this strange mixture of purpose and volatility. I opened my mouth to ask what he was doing, but before I could speak, he raised his voice loud enough to silence the kids, loud enough to make Alex turn his head from across the courtyard, loud enough for every neighbor within range to stop whatever they were doing and look directly at us. He said my name sharply once, twice, like an accusation. And then he stepped into the sharp line of the metallic shadow, letting it cut diagonally across his face, as if the light itself wanted to separate the man I thought I knew from whoever stood in front of me now. The courtyard fell into a stillness that felt unnatural. Even the breeze paused. He shouted that the children weren't his voice cracking under the strain of the words, as if he didn't fully control the force behind them. The sentence slammed into me, hollowing out the air in my lungs so abruptly I couldn't breathe for a moment. The neighbors froze hands, hovering over picnic bowls, phones, toys, every motion caught midair. And I stood there staring at him, trying to understand how the man whose quiet smile filled my mornings could stand in the open and tear our life apart in front of strangers. His face twisted with something between fury and fear, and his hands clenched at his sides with a desperation that looked dangerously close to an unraveling. I told him to lower his voice, tried to pull him out of the metallic shadow and back into himself, but he stepped even deeper into the line of light, as though needing the sharpness to justify the words coming out of his mouth. He hurled accusation after accusation, each one louder and messier than the last. The metallic shadow vibrated subtly across the ground, as if echoing his rage. My pulse hammered in my ears, and the embarrassment coated my skin so thickly it felt like a film I couldn't wash off. I noticed Alex taking a careful step closer, his face tense, not yet intervening, but ready. I saw Mia hovering near the courtyard gate phone in her hand, eyes shifting between us, as though calculating something silently. The moment stretched a raw, agonizing length of time, where I seemed to float outside of myself, watching my life unravel under the full sun. Then the crowd shifted slightly when someone stepped forward, Dr. Lena Corbett. She had her phone in her hand, screen lit with a brightness that cut across the tension like a scalpel. She looked at Jason with a kind of clinical precision, and then she turned the phone toward me. On her screen was an appointment confirmation date time reference number Ref 7B2, a screenshot from the clinic messaging system, evidence number 2. She kept her voice steady, calm, but direct, saying she had sent this to Jason earlier this week as a follow-up to an inquiry he had made privately, one he had refused to explain when she asked for details. The timestamp on the message was recent to recent, and it aligned perfectly with the pattern of contradictions that had begun knitting themselves into the shape of a truth I hadn't wanted to imagine. Jason's face went rigid when the screen lit his features. The metallic shadow cut across his neck like a dark blade. He sputtered something incoherent, denying, twisting, stumbling verbally in a way I had never seen from him. The neighbors watched in stunned silence. The courtyard transformed into an arena of half-lit truths and fractured identities. I felt the heat rising in my face, my throat burning with humiliation, my hands trembling despite my attempts to hide it. He kept shouting, his voice rising into a raw, fraying edge, insisting again and again that the children couldn't be his. His words echoing off the apartment walls until even the birds in the trees went quiet. The metallic shadow flickered slightly as a cloud passed overhead, and for a moment the light shifted just enough for me to see something break behind his eyes, not certainty, but fear, a deep, desperate fear. And that fear wasn't directed at me, it was directed inward. Alex stepped closer, placing himself between us subtly, not quite touching, but offering a silent buffer. The kids peeked from the walkway, their innocent eyes watching something they shouldn't have seen. Dr. Corbett lowered her phone slightly, but her gaze stayed fixed on Jason, sharp and unyielding. I whispered his name, trying one last time to reach the part of him that still remembered gentler days, but he refused to hear it. He broke eye contact, stepped back out of the metallic shadow, and left the courtyard without looking at anyone walking, as if chased by something he couldn't outrun. The metal shadow remained stretched across the pavement long after he disappeared, like a reminder that the split between us had widened into something visible, undeniable. I stood there surrounded by silence, the evidence still glowing faintly in the memory of Dr. Corbett's screen, and realized this wasn't the beginning of a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of a war built on lies neither of us had admitted were already taking shape beneath our feet. The courtyard slowly reclaimed its sounds, but nothing felt normal. Nothing felt intact. The metallic shadow lay across the ground like a line I could never step back over. I sat alone in the living room long after the courtyard had emptied of its witnesses, long after Jason's footsteps had faded into the distance, long after the heat of humiliation had settled into a cold ache beneath my skin. The cracked phone lay on the coffee table in front of me, its spiderweb pattern of fractures catching the dim light in jagged streaks that made the screen look like a broken window into a life that no longer felt whole. I kept staring at it as though it might suddenly ring and undo everything, as if truth could reverse itself with a single vibration. But the phone remained still silent, reflecting a warped version of my face whenever I leaned forward far enough to catch its surface. The room felt too quiet, suffocatingly so, the kind of quiet that makes you hear every small sound amplified the ticking of the wall clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of fabric when I shifted my weight on the couch. I could still hear his voice in my head, loud, sharp, cutting through the courtyard air, like a blade. The children aren't mine. I pressed my fingers into my temples, trying to loosen the echo, but it clung stubbornly, replaying itself with cruel clarity. The cracked phone screen pulsed with faint reflections from the lamp beside me, each flicker stretching the fractures as though the light were peeling the moment open again and again. I picked up the phone, running my thumb along the breaks in the glass. Each ridge felt like a reminder of the night he shattered it during an argument months ago. A night that had felt no awful then, but now seemed like a mere tremor before the earthquake. The doorbell rang softly, the sound slipping through the room like an apology. I froze. I didn't want company. I didn't want questions. I didn't want anyone to witness the weight I was carrying. But when the bell rang a second time, something in the hesitant rhythm told me who it was even before I opened the door. Alex stood on the doorstep, his expression tense, his hands tucked deep into his jacket pockets. He didn't look like a man coming to comfort someone. He looked like a man wrestling with the burden of something he knew he couldn't keep to himself. His eyes searched mine, and he asked if he could come in. I stepped aside silently, too tired to pretend I had the strength to push him away. He entered slowly, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on the cracked phone in my hand. He took a breath, steadying himself as though preparing to walk across a tightrope, and said he needed to tell me something. A warning curled tight in my stomach. His voice softened to a low murmur as he told me about the moment earlier that afternoon when he saw Jason near the parking lot behind the clinic, the same clinic named on the invoice that had burned itself into my memory. Alex's brows knit together as he described how Jason's hand had trembled uncontrollably while he pretended to check his watch, how the timestamp on the watch face had read 09:14. Even though Jason had insisted he was somewhere else entirely at that exact moment. Evidence number 3, a behavioral timestamp inconsistency. I blinked at him, stunned silent for a moment, feeling my breath suspend somewhere between disbelief and dread. He repeated it slower this time, making sure I understood. Jason had been lying. Not vaguely, not accidentally, but with precision. My fingers tightened around the cracked phone, and I felt the glass bite gently into my skin. I remembered how Jason had smashed the phone months earlier when he'd claimed it was accidentally dropped. The memory tasted different now, sour metallic, threaded with the same darkness that colored everything he'd said in the courtyard. Alex cleared his throat, hesitating as if he feared crossing a line, then confessed he had overheard Jason muttering to himself that morning. A single sentence barely audible, "I can't let the truth ruin everything." Those words settled over the room like cold dust. My heart pounded faster, thudding against my ribs with a pulse that felt both frantic and detached. I asked Alex if he was sure, truly sure, and he nodded, the weight of the truth visible in the tension across his shoulders. I looked down at the cracked phone again. The fractured lines on the screen distorted my reflection, making my face look like it had been split into mismatched pieces. I felt like those pieces, too frayed, displaced, pressed into shapes that didn't fit together anymore. The phone's cracks in it seemed to mirror the cracks in my reality. I tried to steady my breathing to form a coherent question, but all I could manage was a quiet, shaky exhale. Alex told me he didn't know what was going on with Jason, but he had seen enough to worry. He apologized for being the bearer of bad news, though I knew none of this was his fault. He had only held up a mirror to the truth Jason had been trying to bury. I thanked him, though my voice barely rose above a whisper. After he left, I slumped back onto the couch, letting the silence seep into every corner of the room. The cracked phone in my hand reflected the lamplight again, splitting my face into fragments one more time before fading to darkness. I stared at it for what felt like hours, trying to understand how a life so carefully built could begin unraveling from things so small, a trembling key, a misplaced bill, a cracked reflection on a screen. The truth felt close enough to taste, but still hidden behind a haze of contradictions. I leaned my head back, closing my eyes, but even in the dark, I saw the phone's fractured reflection superimposed across the memory of Jason's face. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And the cracks were only beginning to show. I moved through the bedroom with a kind of numb deliberation, the kind that settles in only when you've reached the point where fear stops feeling sharp and instead grows slow, heavy, and inevitable. The air in the room felt stale, as though it had been holding its breath along with me, waiting for truths I still wasn't ready to uncover. The half-open drawer on Jason's side of the dresser sat there like an invitation or a warning, or both, its wooden edge casting a thin, stretched shadow across the carpet. The room wasn't fully lit. The afternoon sun pushed in through the blinds and fractured beams, creating a harsh contrast of light and dark that made everything feel slightly distorted. I stood there for several seconds, staring at the drawer, my heart beating with a dull thud against my ribs, my mind whispering reasons to walk away even as my instincts urged me forward. I stepped closer and the shadow on the floor widened, splitting into two uneven shapes that stretched across the carpet, almost like twin paths diverging. The motif echo settled in quietly, the split shadows stretch apart under harsher light. I felt it before I understood it, the visual echo of something breaking wider inside me. The drawer wasn't open enough to see inside, but it wasn't closed either. That in-between space felt symbolic somehow, like something intentionally left ajar, like a secret that couldn't decide whether it wanted to stay hidden. I knelt beside it, my hand hovering over the wooden handle, unsure if touching it would cross a moral line or simply illuminate the line Jason had already crossed long before today. My fingers finally wrapped around the cool wood, and as I pulled the drawer toward me, a louder beam of sunlight cut across the room, slicing sharply through the dust in the air. The shadows split widened again. Inside the drawer were the usual things, miscellaneous papers, a few old receipts, pens, envelopes, a pair of cufflinks he never wore, but all of them had been pushed to the sides, leaving a single folded sheet of paper in the center perfectly placed. Too perfectly. My stomach tightened as I reached for it, the paper slightly thicker than normal printer stock, the edge warm from the sun's direct touch. I unfolded it slowly, My eyes scanning the lines automatically, my brain firing faster than my breath could keep up. The message at the top caught me first: draft email unsent. The ref code at the top corner read VX12 the timestamp 1103, evidence number 4. My pulse stuttered. The email was addressed to someone whose name had been partially deleted, only the first initial remained a stark L. The subject line read, regarding the children. Confidential follow-up. The contents were worse, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they were quiet, unsteady, and full of an intention that left my skin ice cold. He had written that he needed clarification, that he couldn't carry the uncertainty anymore, that recent findings suggested a discrepancy he feared could be devastating. He mentioned seeing results that didn't align with expectations. He wrote about wanting to discuss the children's genetic markers further and asked if there was any possibility of retesting without informing his spouse until he had a clearer understanding of the situation. The words blurred for a moment as my throat tightened. My mind raced, unraveling the contradictions one after another. He was asking about genetic markers. Without telling me, he wanted retesting why. He claimed the children weren't his. Yet here was a message suggesting fear, uncertainty, tension, not the conviction he had thrown at me in the courtyard. And the most damning part, the timestamp was days before his public explosion. He had been planning something long before he humiliated me. This wasn't rage. It was preparation. The drawer creaked slightly as I shifted my weight, and the split shadows stretched across the floor, growing longer under the intensifying afternoon light. The echo pressed itself into my nerves, a visual reminder that everything in my marriage was splitting under light too harsh to ignore anymore. I read the draft again slower this time, catching the subtleties I'd missed. He didn't sound like a man who believed the children weren't his. He sounded like a man terrified of a truth he didn't want to confront. And for the first time, the idea that he wasn't angry at me, but frightened of something else entirely took shape. Fear can twist people. Fear can make them lie. Fear can turn them cruel. But what truth could scare him enough to fracture the life we'd built? I folded the paper back along its original crease, my hands trembling slightly, the weight of the evidence settling into my chest like a stone dropped into a deep well. I sat back on my heels, the carpet imprinting faint marks into my skin, and tried to steady my breathing. The half-open drawer, the scattered papers, the quiet room, they all seemed to tilt together, forming a picture I didn't yet know how to interpret. The draft email was a crack in his story, a sharp crack. And where there's one crack, there are always more. I stood up slowly, still clutching the paper, and looked around the room. The sunlight had intensified, slicing the room into sharper contrasts. That single folded paper in my palm suddenly felt like the hinge between what I thought I knew and what was waiting on the other side of the truth. Something in him wasn't anger. Something was fear. Fear of something bigger than a lie. Fear of a truth he hadn't said out loud. Fear of a truth he might have known long before I did. And the silence that filled the room now felt like a question pulsing from the walls, a question I could no longer ignore. What exactly did he discover that pushed him to tear apart our life instead of facing it? The light shifted again, casting two long, diverging shadows across the floor, and in the widening space between them, I felt the truth stirring, waiting to be found. Mia showed up at my door just before dusk, the sky outside painted in bruised shades of purple and red, the kind of colors that make everything feel heavier, more dramatic, as if the world itself sensed the shift in my life and decided to match it. I hadn't expected anyone, least of all her. We were close in the casual, familial way that in-laws often try to be, but we were never the kind of close that would justify an unannounced visit. Yet there she was standing on my doorstep, with her hair pulled into a tight twist, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide with something that wasn't quite panic, but wasn't calm either. I hesitated before opening the door fully, my hand resting on the cold metal of the doorknob, object number 7, the chill of it pressing into my skin like a warning, whispering through the metal. For a moment I just held it, letting the cold seep into my palm as though it could steady me. When I finally stepped aside to let her in, the doorknob left a faint icy imprint on my hand, a small reminder that nothing about this day had warmth left in it. Mia walked inside with careful steps, glancing around, as if expecting someone else to appear, as if she wasn't convinced the walls were empty or safe. She clutched her phone tightly, both hands wrapped around it like she needed the grounding, like she feared her fingers would betray her nerves if she loosened her grip. I asked if something happened, though I already knew whatever brought her here wasn't casual. She inhaled deeply, her shoulders lifting, then exhaling in a shaky stream that told me she was weighing how much truth to give me. Her eyes flicked to the cracked phone on my table, then back to me, and something softened in her expression, something almost sympathetic. She motioned toward the couch, asking if we could sit. I agreed, even though my pulse was already thrumming with a rhythm that felt too fast. We sat, the silence stretching between us in a thin, brittle line, and Mia finally said she needed to tell me something she had been afraid to admit. The hairs on my arms lifted. She didn't look at me when she spoke. Instead, she stared at her hands, fingers tightening around her phone until the knuckles whitened. She said she'd overheard a conversation a few days earlier, Jason's voice in the parking lot behind the shops on Ridgeview. She hadn't meant to listen, hadn't even realized it was him at first. But the tone caught her a raw, frantic edge. She'd never heard from him before. She described how he stood with his back to her, hands in his hair, pacing beside his car. And then she repeated the line she had heard him say, the line that would become evidence number 5. If they knew who really can't be the father, everything would collapse. The words dropped between us like a stone-shattering glass. My breath hitched. I asked her to repeat it, needing to be certain I heard correctly, needing to know if the sentence carried the exact weight I felt pressing against my chest. She said it again, slower this time, each syllable heavy with implication. Who really can't be the father? Not who isn't the father. Who can't? The difference carved a cold path down my spine. Mia's voice shook when she said she didn't know what he meant, that she considered telling me earlier, but didn't want to spark conflict if it was just a misunderstanding. But now, after the courtyard, after the accusations, after the way he had unraveled in front of everyone she knew, it wasn't a misunderstanding. She believed I deserved to know. I watched her closely, studying the nervous flick of her eyes, the way she twisted her phone case between her palms, the tremble in her voice. She wasn't lying. She was terrified of having waited this long to speak. I leaned back, the room tilting slightly around me as I tried to process the weight of her statement. Everything inside me compressed as though my ribs were closing in around my heart. He wasn't declaring certainty. He was covering fear. Not fear that the children weren't his. Fear that they couldn't be. And the only reason a man fears that is if he already knows something about himself, something fundamental, something medical, something permanent. The cold doorknob imprint on my hand suddenly throbbed with meaning. I asked Mia if she heard anything else, but she shook her head quickly, her voice catching as she said, he had seemed on the verge of breaking whispering fragments she couldn't fully hear. She said she had almost stepped forward, almost asked him what was wrong, almost told him she'd heard more than she should have, but something in his posture stopped her. Something shattered in him that day, she said, and she hadn't known whether approaching him would help or push him further into whatever dark place he'd fallen into. The room felt heavier with every word she spoke. The pieces in my mind began to shift again, rearranging themselves into new shapes, sharper shapes. Mia asked if I was okay, and I nodded, even though I wasn't. Even though I felt the world contracting around the truth that kept slipping closer to the surface. She apologized again and again for not telling me sooner, for waiting until after the courtyard. But I told her gently that I needed the truth now more than I needed apologies for its timing. As she stood to leave, her fingers brushed mine briefly, a small gesture of solidarity or guilt, or both. She left slowly, her steps echoing faintly down the walkway. I followed her to the door, placing my hand once more on the cold doorknob, the chill piercing deeper this time, like a thread sewing itself into my palm. After she slipped away, I closed the door quietly, the soft click sounding far louder than it should have in the stillness of the house. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, letting the truth settle in my bones. His rage wasn't rooted in betrayal. His rage came from fear. Fear of being exposed, fear of a truth he knew before I did, fear of a reality he couldn't face head on. And the words echoed again, who really can't be the father? The cold doorknob seemed to pulse with that truth, as though it held the memory of the moment I first touched it earlier, a second warning I had brushed aside. I stepped back into the dim room, every shadow stretching longer, every angle sharper, every silence louder. Evidence was gathering around me like a storm tightening its circle. The truth was no longer a distant shape. It was approaching step by step, stripping away the illusions I didn't realize I had still been holding on to. And, as I stood there, the cold imprint throbbing faintly against my skin, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was getting closer to the center of a secret he had spent years burying, and Part 8 would tear the rest of it open. Dr. Benton's office sat at the far end of the medical building, tucked behind a frosted glass door that diffused the hallway light into a pale glow. As I walked toward it, the fluorescent bulbs overhead hummed with that sterile resonance unique to clinics, a sound that made my skin prickle even before anything had happened. I clutched my purse strap tightly, trying to steady the tremor in my fingers, and the closer I got, the more the truth seemed to press against my ribs, like something alive trying to claw its way out. When I reached the door, I paused. The small plaque beside it read, "Hale Benton, MD Fertility Specialist." The words felt heavier than I expected, like they carried the weight of answers I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. I lifted my hand to knock, but it hovered inches from the glass for a moment, suspended in hesitation. The silver key object number 8 hung from a hook inside the office, visible through the frosted surface as a faint silhouette. Its metallic outline glowed faintly in the filtered light, as if signaling that this room held the lock to truths I had been circling for days. When I finally knocked, the door opened almost instantly, as if he had been waiting for me. Dr. Benton greeted me with the calm, composed expression of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. He gestured for me to come inside. The office was colder than I expected, both in temperature and feeling. Shelves lined the walls filled with thick binders and medical journals. A small lamp glowed on his desk, and beneath it, lying neatly beside an organized stack of files, was a single sheet of paper clipped to a manila folder stamped with Lab A37. Evidence number 6. The silver key near the cabinet caught the lamplight, throwing a thin, cold stripe across the floor, like a line marking the threshold between what I thought I knew and what I was about to learn. I sat down, hands folded tightly in my lap. My heart thudded heavily, its rhythm echoing in my ears. Dr. Benton sat across from me with deliberate calm, glancing briefly at the folder before looking directly into my eyes. He didn't speak right away. He exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words with surgical precision. Then he said he had been expecting me. My breath caught. He explained that he had spoken earlier with Dr. Corbett, who informed him of Jason's behavior and the incident in the courtyard. His expression tightened slightly as he added that under the circumstances, he believed clarification was necessary. He opened the folder. The crisp slide of paper shifting felt unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He turned the sheet toward me, tapping his finger lightly on the top corner where the lab code was printed. "This," he said, "is the medical note your husband requested." My entire body tensed. He continued. He wanted an updated analysis of his prior fertility results, specifically from the period before your first child was conceived. The air in the room seemed to thin. I forced myself to look at the document, though dread blurred the edges of the text for a moment. When the words finally sharpened into meaning, the breath left my lungs. Long-term infertility, chronic, diagnosed years before our marriage, confirmed irreversible. The note was dated before our first anniversary, before our first child, before everything. I stared at the lines, my heart thudding louder and louder. The room tilted slightly, or maybe it was just me sinking under the weight of the truth. Dr. Benton's voice was steady as he explained further. Jason had come to him in a panic, insisting there must have been a mistake, demanding retesting, searching for any possibility that the results were wrong. But they weren't. They never were. And Jason had known. He had known from the very beginning that fatherhood wasn't biologically possible for him. Yet he married me. Yet he built a life with me. Yet he pretended. For years. Dr. Benton paused, letting the weight settle. I felt my pulse roaring in my ears, each beat striking like a hammer against my skull. My throat tightened as I tried to swallow. The silver key hanging from the cabinet glinted again, the thin beam of light crawling across the wall like a cold finger tracing the truth. I whispered barely audibly. "He knew." Dr. Benton nodded gently. "He knew." My breath stuttered. Heat surged into my face, then drained away just as fast, leaving my entire body cold. Every memory of Jason, every smile, every touch, every moment we shared suddenly wove itself into a completely different pattern. I saw the way he held our newborn daughter the first night, hesitating for a fraction of a second too long. I remembered the way he had reacted to every doctor's appointment, always a little too tense, always a little too interested in details he never asked about again. I recalled the quiet arguments, the sudden defensiveness, the times he looked at the kids with an expression I couldn't decipher. The clues had been there. I just hadn't known how to see them. Dr. Benton explained that Jason had wanted to know if perhaps time or treatment had changed his condition. He said Jason seemed desperate, almost frantic, clinging to the hope that the truth wasn't what it appeared to be. But the tests were unequivocal. He wasn't physically capable of fathering children at any time during our marriage. My hands shook. I pressed them together, but it didn't help. Why didn't he tell me? I whispered. Dr. Benton exhaled softly, his voice lowering. Sometimes the truth a person fears the most isn't the threat itself. It's the idea of being seen through it. I swallowed hard, tears burning the backs of my eyes but refusing to fall. The silver key gleamed again, a small metallic symbol of access to a truth he had locked away for years. And slowly, painfully, everything clicked. His accusations in the courtyard, his panic, his fractured timeline of lies, his trembling, his rage, his fear. He hadn't been accusing me to reveal a truth, he was accusing me to hide one. The truth that he had concealed long before our children were even born. The truth that destroyed the story he had built, the story he had pretended to live. I looked down at the document again, the words blurring, sharpening, blurring. Infertility. Long-term. Irreversible. Known. 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 My voice cracked as I finally managed to speak. He lied to me from the beginning. Dr. Benton didn't deny it. He simply nodded once solemnly. And in that moment, the world split open in a way that couldn't be undone. The silver key caught one last glint of light as the sun dipped lower, leaving the office in a dim, cold quiet. I closed my eyes, feeling the shift inside me, not a break but a resolve, forming slow and deep, like stone cooling into something unmovable. The truth wasn't just near anymore. It was in my hands. Evidence number 6 lay on this desk between us like a blade, and I finally understood the shape of the wound. The house felt different when I walked back inside, emptier, in a way that didn't have anything to do with space and everything to do with truth. The dim lamp in the living room, object number 9, cast a soft, almost trembling glow across the floor, and the shadows it created stretched long and uneven, quivering at the edges like they were bracing for impact. I stood in that dim circle of light for a moment, breathing in slowly, letting the weight of Dr. Benton's words settle deeper into my bones. Long-term infertility, known for years, known before our marriage, known before the children, and hidden. Every moment of his rage, every accusation, every crack in his composure, it all made sense now. His world wasn't collapsing because he believed the children weren't his. His world was collapsing because he knew they couldn't be, and the truth he had buried was beginning to claw its way to the surface. I took a seat under the dim lamp, its faint yellow glow flickering slightly with the movement of air from the vent. My hands rested in my lap, clenched so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't know how long I sat like that, letting the silence stretch, letting the truth settle, letting my breath steady enough to face what had to come next. When the door finally opened behind me, it didn't startle me. I had been waiting. Jason stepped inside quietly, the kind of quiet that comes not from calm but from dread, the kind of quiet that swallows its own sound. He froze when he saw me, sitting beneath the dim lamp, the light casting my shadow long across the floor. He hesitated at the threshold, his breath catching as though he wasn't sure if he should enter or run or pretend nothing had changed. "We need to talk," I said. My voice surprised me. It wasn't shaking. It wasn't breaking. It was steady in a way I didn't feel inside. Jason swallowed hard and stepped closer, the door clicking softly shut behind him. The dim lamp illuminated the edge of his face, catching the tension in his jaw, the panic tightening around his eyes. "I know," he murmured, though he didn't know what I knew not yet. He approached hesitantly, each step sounding too loud against the hardwood floor. When he finally stood across from me, his hands twitched slightly as though debating whether to reach for something the couch the truth, but landing on nothing. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice still steady, still controlled. He blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the question. I needed air," he said. "After everything today, where I asked again, cutting through whatever excuse he was building. His lips parted, but nothing came out. The dim lamp flickered once, throwing a brief ripple of shadow across his face. He shifted his weight, eyes flicking toward the hallway, toward the escape he wouldn't get tonight. "Sit," I said. He sat. The shadows clung to him like guilt. "I didn't start with Dr. Benton. I didn't start with the email draft. I didn't start with the evidence. I started with the truth he'd flung at me in the courtyard." "Why did you tell people the children aren't yours?" His breath caught. His face contorted with something between fear and desperation. Because I had to," he stammered. "Because everything was falling apart and You had to," I interrupted. "Or you were afraid the truth was going to come out." His mouth twitched. His eyes darted to the dim lamp again, as if the light itself were exposing him. "What truth?" he whispered. "That was when it happened." He shifted just slightly nervously, pressing his hand against the stack of mail on the side table, except his movement knocked something loose. A folder. A manila folder. It slipped to the floor with a dull thud, scattering several sheets across the rug. And on the top of the folder in black permanent marker, the tag read, J14. Evidence number 7. My breath stilled. He froze. The moment stretched a thin, trembling pause before he scrambled to reach the papers, his movements frantic, clumsy, desperate. "Don't touch them," I said. The command was quiet, but it landed like a slap. His hands hovered inches above the papers. He swallowed hard. Slowly, painfully, he lowered his hands. I leaned forward and lifted the folder, flipping through the documents with deliberate calm. Appointment receipts, consultation summaries, a printed version of his old test results dated years before our marriage, all bearing the same result. Infertility. Permanent. The truth stared up at me from every page. When I looked up at him, his eyes were rimmed in red, wide with terror. "You knew," I said. "All this time." He shook his head too quickly, too violently, like a child caught in a lie. I didn't know how to tell you," he choked out. "You were happy. We were happy. And when we found out you were pregnant, You let me believe it was ours," I said quietly. "You let me believe you were capable of being their father." His face crumpled. He pressed his palms against his eyes as though trying to block out the truth. "I thought they were a miracle," he said, voice breaking. "I thought maybe the doctors were wrong, or maybe something changed." I convinced myself that it didn't matter, that the past didn't matter. But it did matter, I said, because it wasn't the past. It was the truth. He inhaled sharply, shoulders shaking. "I was terrified," he whispered. "Terrified that if you knew you'd leave. Or worse, pity me." "So instead you lied for years," I said. "And when the truth began unraveling, you attacked me." He flinched. His breathing turned uneven. "I wasn't thinking. I panicked. Everything was slipping And you thought accusing me would cover the cracks in your story," I said. "You thought humiliation would distract from the truth you were afraid to face." He didn't deny it. Couldn't. He sat there, shoulders hunched, shaking the dim lamp, casting fractured shadows across his face. "Please," he whispered. "Please, you have to understand what it felt like." "No," I said. "I don't." I stood slowly, the folder still in my hand, its weight digging into my palm in a way that grounded me. "But you're going to understand what comes next." His eyes widened. "Aaron." "Don't," I said. "Not yet." I walked toward the dim lamp, the shadows pulling with me like threads of the life we'd once woven together. "Tomorrow," I said softly, "I decide what this truth becomes." He reached for me then, but his movement sent the shadows stretching long and thin across the floor, and the dim lamp, the fragile flickering witness of everything, glowed just enough to show the distance he had created long before tonight. And there, under that dim light, the story of our life finally split open in full. Dr. Corbett's office was quieter than I remembered, the kind of clinical quiet that absorbs sound instead of echoing it, a quiet that feels intentional, protective, almost too gentle for the kind of truth waiting behind the closed door. I stood in the hallway for a long moment before knocking, my fingers brushing against the wall, as if steadying themselves on something more solid than the air around me. The mirror shard object number 10 sat in a small tray just inside the doorway, catching the fluorescent light overhead and fracturing it into splintered reflections that scattered across the floor like broken truths. When Dr. Corbett opened the door, the light shifted and one sliver of reflection cut across my shoe like a thin blade. She stepped aside wordlessly, her expression steady but tightened with the weight of the conversation she knew she was about to initiate. I walked in slowly, letting the door close behind me with a soft click, and the sound felt strangely final. The air was cool, carrying a faint antiseptic scent that made my throat tighten. I sat across from her desk, the mirror shard reflecting two uneven halves of my silhouette on the floor, and for a moment I couldn't tell which fractured shape was closer to the truth of who I had become. Dr. Corbett settled into her chair with a slow exhale, folding her hands over a thick manila folder. The genetic panel summary, evidence number 8, was inside. I could tell from the single clipped corner peeking out from beneath her fingers. My pulse hammered once hard, then steadied itself into a dull, heavy thud. She didn't rush. She watched me carefully, as if assessing whether the ground beneath me was stable enough to withstand what she had to place on it. "Aaron," she began softly. "Before I show you this, I need to confirm. Are you ready to hear everything?" I nodded, though my breath came shallow. My spine felt lined with ice. She opened the folder. The sound was crisp, almost sharp. The paper shifting like a blade, slicing through the last layer of uncertainty between me and the truth. She turned the top page around for me to see. The header, genetic panel summary specimen, number 00421. The test Jason had requested. The test he had avoided explaining. The test he had feared. Below the header were the results. I didn't breathe as I scanned the numbers, the markers, the highlighted fields. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Because the truth didn't come in a scream, it came in the clean lines of medical certainty. The children were biologically mine. Fully. Entirely. Without question. And they were not biologically linked to another man. Not by error, not by chance, not by mistaken identity. But the part that struck me hardest wasn't their certainty, it was his. The panel didn't just confirm the children's markers, it confirmed his. Or rather, it confirmed the absence of any possibility that he could be their biological father. The report didn't waver, it didn't soften, it didn't offer hope. It simply stated the truth he had known long before any of this began. Long-term infertility, permanent condition, no viable sperm production. The same diagnosis Dr. Benton had shown me in the medical note, but here in black and white tied directly to our children's genetic markers. The contradiction between his accusations and the scientific truth glowed like a neon wound. My breath caught in my throat, lodged halfway up my lungs. I stared at the panel, the words blurring as the weight of the truth pressed against my chest until it hurt. Doctor! Corbett watched me silently, giving me space to process. When I finally exhaled, the sound trembled out of me. He knew I whispered. He knew from the beginning. She nodded slowly. He did. His medical records made that clear years ago. He asked me once if there was any chance of unexpected improvement. He didn't want you to know. Heat seared my eyes. Not tears, anger. Rage. The kind of deep-buried anger that doesn't erupt, but rises slowly, steadily like magma pushing toward the surface. I pressed my palm against the desk, steadying myself, and that was when the mirror shard on the tray caught my eye again. The fractured reflection showed my face split into two uneven halves, one shadowed, one lit. And in that fractured light, something inside me finally cracked open enough to speak a truth I had held inside for years. I did something I said quietly, my voice thinning with the weight of confession. Dr. Corbett looked at me, eyebrows lifting slightly. I swallowed. Years ago, I accessed Jason's medical file. The admission tasted metallic in my mouth, like guilt sharpened into something that cut on the way out. I knew something was wrong. He'd been acting strange, avoiding conversations about children dodging appointments. I saw a file open one afternoon at work. It had his name on it. I exhaled shakily. I shouldn't have done it. I know that. But I saw the diagnosis. I saw the date. I saw everything. Dr. Corbett didn't react with judgment, only quiet understanding. And you kept it to yourself. I did. I said, my voice cracking on the last word. Because he never mentioned it. Because when I found out I was pregnant, he didn't question it. He seemed happy, relieved. I convinced myself that maybe I misunderstood, that maybe the file was outdated or wrong. And I buried it. The truth spilled out of me with a force I hadn't expected. I wanted to tell him. I almost did. Dozens of times. But every moment I tried, he'd say something gentle, something soft, something that made me believe he was happy. And then the years passed, and it felt too late. The mirror shard trembled faintly as the HVAC kicked on, sending a ripple of fractured light across the floor. My reflection shattered briefly, then reformed. Dr. Corbett finally spoke, her voice steady. You weren't trying to deceive him. You were trying to protect your family. I shook my head, tears gathering at my lashes. But I should have said something. I should have told him. I should have... No, she interrupted, firm but gentle. He had the truth first. Long before you did. Long before the pregnancies. Long before the children. He was the one who chose deception. Her words hit me like a steady hand pressed against my spine, supporting me where I was starting to bend. She lifted the genetic panel again. These results don't lie. There was no betrayal from you. I inhaled shakily. He made me believe. He made you doubt yourself, she corrected. Because the truth terrified him. Silence fell again, heavy but clearer somehow. I looked down at the mirror shard and the fractured reflection staring back at me. For the first time in days, I felt something settle inside me, not peace exactly, but clarity. A cold, decisive clarity. The kind that comes when the last missing piece finally clicks into place. I lifted my head. What happens now? Dr. Corbett folded the folder gently and placed it between us. Now you decide what to do with the truth. Her words lingered in the air like the echo of a verdict. I rose from the chair, my hand brushing the mirror shard's edge. It didn't cut me, but the coldness of it seeped into my skin, grounding me in the reality of what I had to do next. As I left the office, the fractured reflections followed me across the floor, merging into a single elongated shadow as I stepped into the hallway carrying the truth with me like a final decisive blade. The house was silent when I walked in, the kind of silence that doesn't settle but hangs suspended like dust in a single line of weak afternoon light. The receipt slip object number 11 rested on the table where I had placed it earlier, its pale rectangle lying just beneath the dim glow of the overhead light, waiting like the final piece in a puzzle that had long stopped pretending to be solvable. I stood there for a moment staring at it, feeling the weight of every truth I had gathered press against my chest, steady and cold. This slip wasn't loud, dramatic, or damning on its own. It was small, almost insignificant, a simple proof of a clinic visit Jason had made behind my back. But like everything else, it fit perfectly into the pattern of lies he had built around us. The structure he had been desperately trying to keep from collapsing, and today it would collapse. Jason emerged from the hallway, slowly, hesitant, wary. The moment he saw me standing over the table, his breath faltered. He didn't speak. His eyes flicked from me to the receipt slip, then back to me, and I watched his throat tighten as he swallowed. For the first time in years, I felt nothing when I looked at him. Not fear, not confusion, not longing for who he used to be. Just clarity. Cold, sharp. The clarity of a mirror held up without mercy. "Sit down," I said quietly. He obeyed, moving like someone whose legs weren't fully connected to the ground. His hands hovered awkwardly above his knees before settling, trembling lightly. I sat across from him, sliding the receipt slip across the table so it stopped in front of him. He hesitated only for a moment before touching it, his fingers curling around the paper like he already knew what was coming and wanted to slow it down, delay it, undo it. But he couldn't. Not anymore. "You lied," I said. "Not just once. Not just recently. For years." His eyes closed. His jaw tightened. A ripple of guilt crossed his face, too late to mean anything. "I didn't know how to tell you," he whispered. "But you knew I said. You knew before the children, before the pregnancies, before the marriage. You knew what you were." His eyes snapped open, panic flickering. "No, Aaron, please." "You knew," I repeated, voice steady. "And you let me believe everything was normal. You let me build a life with you on a lie so big it swallowed everything we were supposed to be." His breath hitched. I could see the moment he realized there was no way out. No version of the story where he could twist the truth into something gentler, something survivable. His eyes shifted down to the receipt slip again, and he gave a weak, broken exhale. "I was scared," he said. "I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to be less than." "You didn't want to be seen," I interrupted. "Not for who you really were. Not for what the medical files said. Not for the truth." He flinched as if I'd struck him. That was when I placed the folder from Dr. Corbett on the table. The thick manila cover fell open with a soft, decisive sound, exposing the genetic panel summary and all 8 pieces of evidence arranged in silent accusation. He stared at it, frozen. I watched his entire persona unravel, his shoulders collapsing inward, his breath becoming uneven, his composure leaking out of him like air through a punctured tire. He reached for the paper with trembling fingers, but I moved it away slightly, not out of cruelty, but because the truth wasn't his to distort anymore. It was mine to lay bare. "You didn't accuse me because you thought the children weren't yours," I said. "You accused me because you knew they couldn't be. And you were terrified someone else would find out long before you were ready to look at your own reflection." His chest rose sharply, a sound escaping him that wasn't quite a sob, but wasn't far from it either. "Please," he whispered. "Please listen to what I asked calmly. More lies. Versions of the truth tailored so you don't look as awful as you actually chose to be." He covered his face with both hands, fingers digging into his cheeks. The silence tightened around us. He exhaled a single broken sound, the kind someone makes when they finally realize there's no excuse left to hide behind. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said into his hands. When we got the first positive pregnancy test, I didn't understand. I thought maybe I'd healed somehow, or that the doctors were wrong, or you wanted a miracle more than you wanted honesty," I said. "So you pretended. And then you pretended some more. And when pretending stopped working, you lashed out at me." He slowly lowered his hands, eyes wet and unfocused. "I thought if the truth came out, everything we built would fall apart. It didn't fall apart because of the truth I said. It fell apart because you lied." He shook his head weakly, but the movement had no conviction. The receipt slip still lay between us like a small, quiet anchor to everything I now understood. I pushed the genetic panel summary toward him. "Look at it," I said. He stared at it, blinking through tears. The numbers, the markers, the highlighted fields, all of it spelling out the fact he had known his entire adult life. His chin quivered. He touched the edge of the document with a shaking finger. "I never wanted this," he whispered. "But you did it," I replied. "You made choices. You let me build a life with you while you withheld the single truth that defined all of it." I leaned forward slightly. "And then you humiliated me. Publicly. Violently. Not because I betrayed you, but because you couldn't bear the weight of your own truth." He sobbed, then quiet, strangled, desperate. Tears splattered onto the table, smudging the corner of the receipt slip. It didn't move me. Not because I lacked compassion, but because compassion had been burned out by the magnitude of the deception. "What are you going to do?" he choked out. I sat back, letting the silence fill in the answer before I said it. "I'm going to stop carrying the part of this story that never belonged to me." He lifted his head, eyes red and frantic. "Aaron, please." "No," I said. "Not anymore." I gathered the evidence slowly, deliberately. The invoice, the screenshot, the behavioral mismatch, the email draft, Mia's overheard line, Dr. Haw, Benton's medical note, the J14 folder, and finally the genetic panel. As I stacked them, the sound was soft but decisive, like the closing of a door that would never be opened again. "These are yours," I said. "This truth belongs to you, and you're going to face it." He stared at the stack as though it were a weapon aimed at his chest, because in a way it was. A weapon he had built, a weapon forged out of his own fear. "I'm leaving tomorrow," I said, standing. "With the kids. With my dignity. With the truth you tried to bury." He lunged slightly, reaching for me, but his movement halted halfway, his courage, the same courage he had hidden from all his life failing him in the one moment he needed it. The receipt slip fluttered slightly in the draft of his movement, landing neatly atop the stack of evidence. A final punctuation mark. A final record of his lies. His voice broke as he whispered my name, but I was already walking away, the room dimming behind me as the lamp flickered one last time, a quiet, trembling witness to the end of the story he had written in shadows. Tomorrow I would write the rest. The house is still when I wake before dawn, the kind of stillness that feels deliberate, like the world knows. This is the day I reclaim the air inside my lungs. The audio recorder object number 12 rests on the edge of the dining table, its small red light blinking in a slow, patient rhythm, waiting for me to give shape to the truth I've spent days unraveling. The room carries a faint chill left over from the night, the kind that settles into the walls and makes every sound sharper. I stand there for a long moment, fingers grazing the smooth surface of the recorder, feeling the coolness of the plastic seep into my skin. This time the truth won't be buried. This time the story will be mine. When I finally press the button, the recorder emits a soft beep and the red light steadies. I take a breath long and slow, letting it fill the space that used to belong to fear. This is for the record. I say my voice steady in the morning, quiet. For clarity. For closure. The sound of my own voice echoes faintly back to me, not fragile or hesitant, but clear. Clearer than it's been in years. Outside the window, the first line of sunlight breaks over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the floor. The shadows stretch long, thin, and then slowly they begin to merge, settling into one single, unbroken line. The motif resolve forms quietly in the air around me as I speak. The shadows finally merge into one line, I say softly, acknowledging the moment grounding it. I begin recounting everything, not for anyone else, not for him, not for the neighbors or the doctors or the people who witnessed our life crack open, but for myself, for the part of me that had been shrinking in the dark without even realizing it. I describe the flickering bulb in the hallway, the first moment I felt the truth trying to surface. I describe the glass reflection in the kitchen, the invoice Alex handed me, the trembling key, the metallic shadow in the courtyard when Jason hurled his accusations like stones. I describe the cracked phone screen and the timestamp mismatch that fractured the first layer of denial inside me. I describe the half-open drawer, the draft email, the fear laced through his words. I describe Mia's confession at my door, the cold doorknob pressing its warning into my palm. I describe the medical note in Dr. Benton's office, the silver key catching the light like an omen. I describe the moment I confronted him under the dim lamp, the folder J14 spilling its truth across the floor. And then I describe the final piece, the genetic panel summary that tied everything together with cold, unyielding clarity. My voice never wavers. Not once. Not even when emotion catches at the edges. Because truth, when finally spoken, doesn't tremble. It stands. The children stir quietly upstairs. Their soft movements filter through the ceiling, warm and steady, grounding me even more. They are my certainty, my anchor, the truest proof that some things cannot be shaken no matter how violently lies try to claw at them. I take another breath, letting the recorder capture the sound, the weight, the steadiness. I'm leaving today, I say, with them, with the truth. The house holds the words gently, as if absorbing them, as if acknowledging that this is the final time they will ever be spoken inside these walls. I walk to the hallway, the floor cool beneath my feet, and pause at the doorway of the children's room. They're still asleep, curled under blankets, their faces soft and peaceful in the early light. A tenderness rises in my chest, not fragile, not aching, but strong. fierce, protective. I move quietly to gather our things. Clothes, favorite toys, documents, small pieces of our life that still belong to us. Everything is deliberate, nothing rushed. Not escape, choice. When I return to the dining table, the recorder is still running, patient and steady. I take it in my hand and bring it closer to my lips. This is the last entry I say. Not because the story ends here, but because the part written in shadows ends today. The red light reflects faintly in the window, a tiny spark of certainty. He will have to face his truth alone, I continue. And I will face my future with the children free from what he built in silence. I pause, letting the air settle around me. No more lies, no more shadows. The house feels different, already lighter, untangled, like something has been lifted from the corners that used to hold fear. I slip the recorder into my bag. The soft weight of it feels like permission. My final act inside the house is simple, turning off the dim lamp in the living room. The shadows gather for a moment, then collapse into a single line as daylight pushes them back. When I open the front door, the cold morning air rushes in, crisp and clean. I carry our bags to the car, my movements sure and measured. The sunlight grows stronger with every passing second, stretching across the driveway, warming the edges of everything it touches. The kids appear behind me moments later, sleepily rubbing their eyes, their small hands reaching for mine. Their trust settles into my palms like something sacred. I help them into the car, buckle them and brush the hair from my daughter's face. "Where are we going?" she asks softly. "Somewhere better," I say. The engine hums to life. I don't look back at the house when I pull away. There's nothing left for me inside it. The road stretches ahead, open, clear, carrying the promise of a life lived without shadows. The sun rises higher, bright and unwavering. And as I drive forward, the truth sits beside me, not heavy, not painful, just real, just mine. The past stays behind. The future unfolds quietly ahead, and the shadows at last merge into one clean, steady line.